Alrighty friends, welcome back. So in this set of videos, hopefully one video, we're going to talk about the 7 different types of water pollution that were mentioned in the previous video, and I want to go into some further details about some of these different types of pollution. So recall that there is one other water pollution type that's not mentioned here. It's called noise pollution. I just don't necessarily go into details of it here, but it is one, again, that's very important, especially in the oceans and for some of our migratory creatures who rely on sound in order to live, thrive, and survive with hunting or communicating with other animals, even really far away, which is really quite fascinating. So going back to some of the ones listed, starting with disease-causing organisms. So these are infectious organisms that cause disease, which include, of course, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, or worms. And so what could, and I do also want to mention with all of these 7 different types of water pollution, we're going to try to consider, and I also want you to consider, various sources of these types of pollution and also some problems that could come out of these types of pollution, and what are ways maybe you could solve for them. So some sources of disease-causing organisms include human and animal feces. So we all know that poo-poo is not very good for us to ingest, but something that I don't think really consider is animal poo-poo and how it can actually be problematic to like groundwater sourcing, but also like runoff and storm drains and things like that. So if you are someone that has a dog, and you hopefully routinely walk your dog has to take a poop. You know, it's a thing. It's a natural thing. Everybody does it. So it's really, really important that you clean up after your animal, not only because 1, it's the good thing to do as a responsible pet owner, but 2, it can actually aid in polluting waterways. So clean up after your pets. It's a really, really big thing here. So of course, ways that you can lessen those problems, clean up after your pet. And next up, and perhaps very, very importantly, things called plant and algae nutrients. So this includes chemicals, like most importantly, nitrogen and phosphorus, that can stimulate plant and algae growth. So if you remember, like way back near the beginning of the semester, we talked about biogeochemical cycles, and we talked about the nitrogen cycle, and we tipped our toe into phosphorus cycles. But basically what can happen is you can have an influx of these nutrients into waterways, which stimulates phytoplankton growth. Sources of these nutrients can be human and animal waste, going back to the previous slide, plant residues, atmospheric deposition, and that basically just means that it's coming from the atmosphere, whether it be through precipitation or deposition just onto hard surfaces. And fertilizer runoff. This fertilizer runoff is one of like the main reasons for something called dead zones, which I'll touch on here in a sec. Some problems of plant algae nutrients include it's smelling bad, and also something called eutrophication, which I'll touch on here in the next few slides. So this picture here on the right actually shows an algae bloom. So you can see how the water, instead of it looking nice and blue, which we would normally expect, we're seeing this green color here. Also, if you're like, oh, phosphorus, that seems kind of familiar. Why does that seem familiar? More and more detergents and cleaning agents these days now say phosphorus free. So this actually helps aid with decreasing phosphorus pollution coming from humans in that sort of way. So kind of interesting there. So eutrophication, what does that mean? So here we're looking at healthy water. So this is actually Crater Lake, which is up in Oregon, here on the left-hand side. So you can see that the water is very, very beautiful blue. And with a healthy body of water, you would actually see relatively low nutrient levels. The algae is kept in check, really good dissolved oxygen levels, and abundant fish and shellfish. So light is able to penetrate through. Everyone's all good, happy, and healthy, and living a great life. Many lakes in the Sierra Nevadas are thankfully healthy, namely our beautiful Lake Tahoe. However, if we were to look at unhealthy water supplies, this example here, you can see that this lake or pond is completely covered in this green color, which is algae. So with a high algal and bacterial growth means that there's very, very low dissolved oxygen and a loss of some, if not all, aquatic life. So because of sediment and nitrogen and phosphorus can enter through runoff, that allows for these blooms to happen, which blocks out sunlight, which then underwater photosynthesis can't occur, which means plants will die, oxygen's not being produced. And even as these things die, you have our decomposers that are underwater as well, which use up even more oxygen, which can allow oxygen to be dissolved even further. So nutrients can actually be added slowly and naturally over time, or it can be added unnaturally very quickly. With Lake Tahoe, or going back to that example, we have nutrient runoff being added to Lake Tahoe through runoff, septic systems, and wastewater treatment plants. There's a link actually in the intro page this week of Keep Tahoe Blue, which is that, and perhaps you've seen bumper stickers and stuff of that sort if you're in California. So that's kind of to help aid in not putting nutrients into Tahoe. And yeah, so all of this sort of eutrophication, too much eutrophication can create something called dead zones. So one of the biggest dead zones in the United States is that of the Gulf of Mexico. So this is an image that I got for 2023 of the dead zone expanse in the Gulf of Mexico. So the more red colors here indicate less and less oxygen, whereas the yellow colors indicate more oxygen. And the reason why this is so intense is because the Mississippi River flows into the Gulf of Mexico right here. This is where the city of New Orleans is, by the way, up here, kind of up where this little lake is. And so you have all of this agricultural runoff coming through the entire Gulf of Mexico watershed. Refer back to the previous couple of videos, reminding us what a watershed is. And all of that flows through the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. Way too much nutrients, algal blooms occur, and these dead zones can be basically completely devoid of life. So no fish, no shellfish. And if you're aware, the Gulf of Mexico is a huge fishing industry. So if you don't have these fish, then you obviously are going to have a huge impact on the fishing industry. So not great for those who, like to fish to sustain their livelihoods. And also, of course, it's not good on an ecological level either. Next up, we have sediment pollution. And so sediment pollution comes from clay, silt, sand, and or gravel, which is then suspended in the water. When water is moving a lot, it allows for this flow of water plus materials. And so it basically makes the water really murky or really cloudy looking. And so when the water is murky, then the sediment blocks that light, which decreases photosynthesis. And this will, of course, settle out over time as the water velocity or water speed decreases. So things that can also impact this would be storm activity and wave activity. So I encourage you, next time you go to the beach, especially if it's a really windy day, try to go out and kind of be at a higher level and try to look out onto the waterways and see if you can see any kind of murkiness or cloudiness closer to the beach area. And that would be a sort of type of sediment pollution. I want you to try to also consider other ways in which sediment pollution could be harmful, not just by blocking light, but what other ways could be harmful here. And again, I want you to try to really think of what could point or non-point sources be. And then, of course, even some other solutions here as well. Next up, we have organic compounds. So this is meaning chemicals that contain carbon atoms which are bonded to hydrogen atoms. So some common examples of this include pesticides, solvents, industrial chemicals, antibiotics or steroids / hormones, etc. So there's many other different kinds of organic compounds that are out there, but these are some that that maybe you're familiar with. And here's another list here. This is kind of from an older environmental science book, so there's probably ways that this can be updated, of course. But these are just some organic compounds that are found in polluted water. So things like pesticides and solvents, plastics industry through vinyl chloride. So I encourage you to maybe pause the video and read through this table of the compounds and some of the reported health effects here as well. Something that is kind of come up more in conversation are the idea of steroids and hormones being in the water, just because more and more people are taking hormone replacement therapy or even things like birth control. And then that is not fully consumed by your body. And so then it goes into your waste. And then that waste then goes into potentially water treatment plants, but maybe they can't get fully treated out of the water, which then we are consuming, inadvertently consuming these types of things, which can have issues along the way. Of course, the sources vary here. So again, I want you to try to consider point versus non-point sources. So I encourage you to pause the video and think of other ways in which these sources can come into the waterways. Of course, there are different problems here as well with organic compounds, toxicity of the water, teratogens and mutagens, endocrine disruptors. That's kind of going back into that idea of steroids and hormones and the problems that can arise from that. And then also an increase in biological oxygen demand, or BOD. So more oxygen is needed by microorganisms to decompose biological waste, which means that oxygen levels in the water decline. So almost in some certain way, you could imagine that this can also aid in increasing dead zone areas. This can also help with birth defects as well. So pretty interesting here. Next up, we have inorganic chemicals. So these are chemicals that contain elements other than carbon. So examples here would be like heavy metals or salts or acids. These sources also vary quite a bit as well, but it can be from industrial contamination from factories, deposition from airborne pollution. Again, going back to that idea that the atmosphere, when it rains, it collects pollution in the air and then it rains it out, or it rains it onto whatever source it's raining onto, waterways, forests, grasslands, etc. Through processes of mining or runoff from roads. That's a big one we don't really think about either. Some problems here, of course, include toxicity of the water, or these two very important bullet points, which were actually brought up in a module that we didn't get to in this class. So I encourage you, if you have time, go back to module 4.3, and it talks further about this idea of bioaccumulation and biomagnification, but it is something that, of course, I want to touch on here. So bioaccumulation means that there's this buildup of a substance in the tissues of an organism over the course of their lifetime. So the more and more they eat of a substance, the more and more it builds up in their bodies. And then biomagnification means that there's an increased concentration of substances in the tissue of animals at successively higher levels of the food chain. So this includes, and maybe you've heard about this most through mercury in tuna and things like that. So that's a really big idea of biomagnification as well as bioaccumulation. So in terms of sources and examples here, Flint, Michigan is a really big example of industrial contamination. Of course, airborne mercury from coal burning power plants, that's a big thing. Past industries also include, we used a lot of mercury to extract gold during the gold rush, and lead and mercury have a lot of very well-known, many adverse effects, mainly on neurotoxicity, which is kind of course, a pretty big deal. Next up, we have thermal pollution. So thermal pollution simply means that there's a raising or lowering of temperatures from normal levels. Some sources here include industry, or even logging and road building. And you may be like, wait, hang on, how does that have an impact on the temperature of the water? Well, if you remove shading trees via logging, then you're allowing for more sunlight to come down on a stream, a river, or a pond, which will in turn warm up that waterway. And maybe the animals that are within that particular waterway are not adapted to higher water temperature levels. A lot of water animals are very well adapted to their current environment, and it takes a long time for them to adapt to a new environment. So that can be kind of detrimental there. But different species have different tolerances for temperature, so it's not a one size fits all for everybody. And this can also bring in invasive species, or there can be a disruption of migration patterns, which is really quite fascinating here. Also, of course, range of tolerance or artificial environments kind of play into this as well. And also, and I tend to forget about this last bullet point, but oxygen solubility decreases as temperatures increase. So there's generally less oxygen in warmer waters than there are in cooler waters, which is really fascinating here. And then the picture here in the back is looking at coral bleaching. So coral is a huge ecosystem, a very important ecosystem in the oceans, and coral bleaching is mainly due to water temperatures increasing and the photosynthetic organisms, or the zooanthellae that are within the coral, get too stressed out, and so they throw up their deuces and they leave, which leaves just the polyps and the coral skeleton behind, the skeleton being white, which is what we call coral bleaching. Lastly, we have radioactive substances. These are unstable isotopes that spontaneously emit radiation. Some sources here include mining and processing radioactive materials, industrial waste, of course, power plants, the weapon industry, and hospitals. And then ones that we think of a lot here are nuclear accidents as well as natural sources. Again, consider which are from point and non-point sources. The most recent nuclear accident that we know of course, is Fukushima. And scientists assumed that we would see radioactive material in the coastal waters here in California about a year after the Fukushima event, and that is exactly what happened. So this is really a big reminder as to why it's really important for us to be continuously testing waters and making sure the water is good for our consumption. And last idea here, I want to iterate that all of these different types of pollution can even be mixed. So we can actually have a mixture of one or two or more types of pollution within the various waterways. And oftentimes that is what sewage has to offer for us, which of course is not great. So those are the 7 different types of water pollution and some more specific explanations of them. But again, I encourage you to go through each one and try to find some of your own potential examples or issues, point and non-point source, places where they come from, and things of that nature. So thank you so much for watching this particular video.